Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host. Thank you for joining us. Before jumping into today's breaking story, just a few quick announcements. First, a new report from Democracy at Work will be out this week titled Supply Chains and Sanctions: How Tariffs Rewrite Global Alliances. And you can find it on our website, democracyatwork.info. Second, registration is open for our fall course, Critically Understanding Trade and Power, a 4-week seminar on how economic policy becomes political leverage. And third, mark your calendars. A public town hall, Allies or Competitors? The Future of North American Trade. Live in Toronto and online. Okay. Today's story takes us from the soybean fields of Iowa to the shipyards of Busan and then north to a silent lumber mill in Quebec. It's a story about trade, promises, and the peculiar way Washington defines the word ally. The title could almost write itself, How Trump's Tariff Theater Turned Friends into Collateral Damage. Let's begin with the scene you won't see on television: a rust-red container ship rolling across the Pacific, inside 40 tons of American soybeans, sealed tight, labeled Midwest Premium. Its destination, Shanghai. But the ship pauses first in Busan, South Korea, just long enough for the containers to be reshuffled, retagged, and rerouted. A quiet trick of trade logistics that now defines the post-tariff world. Because when Trump promised to bring American exports back, what he really did was reroute them through a maze of loopholes that only corporations could afford to navigate. In this episode, we're following that soybean cargo and another letter written by a farmer in Iowa who believed Trump's tariff cuts on China would save his family's business. It begins, Mr. President, thank you for standing up to Beijing. You've given us a chance to sell again. He sent it in 2020 when the administration slashed tariffs on Chinese imports in exchange for Beijing's pledge to buy billions in U.S. agricultural goods. The headline back then said, America wins again. But that's only half the story. At the same moment, in a colder place, Quebec, Canada, another letter was written. This one by a sawmill owner, a man named Alain Dubois. His letter read, Mr. President, you called us allies, yet our lumber sits unsold, taxed at 20%. My workers are gone. The factory is silent. His was the sound of an economy punished not for cheating, but for trusting too much. While Washington cut tariffs to make peace with China, it raised them on Canada, its neighbor, partner, and supposed brother in democracy. This is what I want us to understand. Trade policy is not only about numbers, it's about narratives, about who gets framed as an enemy and who gets sacrificed as a friend. Trump's trade war was never a war at all. It was a bargaining show designed to look strong at home while fracturing the alliances that once gave the U.S. leverage abroad. When Beijing demanded tariff relief in exchange for soybean purchases, the administration complied because those deals produced instant headlines, but there was no photo op for Canadian lumber, no press conference for silent factories. By the way, the irony runs deeper. In 2018, the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada, citing national security. Think about that. A Canadian beam used in a Michigan bridge was treated as a security threat, while Chinese imports were given tax breaks to restore balance. This is called efficiency in the make-believe world of Washington, D.C. The container ship leaves Busan. It's carrying soybeans that will be logged as American exports to China, though the paperwork was altered, the routes disguised, the profits absorbed by logistics intermediaries. The farmer in Iowa thinks he won. The letter from Quebec was never answered. Two men, two letters, one policy difference spelled out in a single word: ally. We need to remember that America First always had a second clause: allies last. What looked like patriotism was in fact isolationism disguised as strategy. And when leaders turn trade into theater, it's the workers on both sides of the border who end up paying for the ticket. Before we move further, let's pause and look closely at how this happened, not as a sequence of random tariffs, but as a deliberate pattern of divide and weaken. Trump's advisors called it flexible protectionism. In practice, it was a geopolitical sorting machine: reward adversaries who play along, punish allies who don't. What began as a promise to level the playing field quickly turned into a global shell game of shifting duties, exemptions, and trade corridors. And every shell, every swap had a winner and a loser. Let's talk numbers for a moment. Between 2018 and 2020, U.S. soybean exports to China did rebound from near collapse during the height of the trade war to roughly 26 million tons a year after Beijing agreed to resume purchases. But look beneath that headline. The U.S. government paid out nearly $28 billion in farm subsidies during that same period, more than double what farmers earned back in export profits. It was a bailout, not a victory. The money came from taxpayers, the headlines, from photo ops on rural stages. Meanwhile, Canada, the largest buyer of American manufactured goods, watched its exports to the U.S. shrink under security tariffs on steel, aluminum, and wood. For every job supposedly saved in U.S. mills, more were lost in Canadian provinces that had supplied the U.S. for decades. Those weren't distant competitors. They were communities intertwined with the same rail lines, power grids, and families across the northern border. Now let's return to our two letters, symbols of that imbalance. The farmer's note from Iowa eventually appeared in a campaign ad. The president's staff read it on stage. American farmers are winning again, they said, with flags behind them. But Alain Dubois' letter from Quebec never made it past the trade desk. In the logic of Washington, the Canadian worker didn't fit the story. You can't sell solidarity when your strategy depends on betrayal. By the way, the irony deepens when we remember the rhetoric. We're protecting democracy, Trump said, from unfair trade. But democracy at its core is collective decision making. Trade, by its nature, is interdependence. You can't protect one by destroying the other. The tariffs on Canada fractured what was once called the North American Partnership, a triad of shared supply chains linking Mexico's assembly plants, Canada's resources, and America's technology. Under Trump, that triad turned into three isolated economies, each scrambling for survival, each suspicious of the other. Let's look at the container ship again. It's now nearing Shanghai's coast, guided by Chinese logistics firms that once feared American sanctions. They no longer do. Washington's inconsistency became their insurance policy. Every tariff lifted from Chinese goods was a green light for Beijing's state-backed corporations to expand deeper into the Pacific trade routes, precisely where American alliances had once been strongest. In other words, by trying to punish China and pressure Canada, Trump achieved the reverse. He strengthened China's negotiating hand while alienating America's most dependable neighbors. A policy that claimed to make America great again instead made America solitary, powerful in slogans, but weakened in supply. There's a lesson here, and it's not only about economics, it's about trust. International trade runs on trust the same way credit does. Break it once and everyone starts demanding collateral. Canada began signing independent trade deals with Europe and the Indo-Pacific. South Korea tightened its agricultural agreements with Australia instead of the US. The circle of confidence broke link by link under the weight of unpredictable tariffs and personal diplomacy. We need to remember that economic leadership isn't about who shouts loudest at the negotiation table. It's about who others choose to follow when the shouting stops. When Trump replaced policy with publicity, he created a vacuum. And in global trade, vacuums don't last. Someone always fills them, usually the very rival you thought you were outsmarting. Let's take this story forward. Picture the aftermath. The Midwest farmer who once celebrated tariff relief now sits at his kitchen table staring at rising fuel prices and shrinking orders. The checks from Washington stopped coming, but the debts did not. His soybeans are still leaving for China, yes, but the profit margin has evaporated, swallowed by higher shipping costs and the dominance of Chinese logistics firms that now own much of the freight network he depends on. The irony? The win he cheered for has become dependence in disguise. Now look north again to Quebec. The sawmill in Saint-Félicien stands silent. A few machines are wrapped in plastic, rust gathering on conveyor belts. Alain Dubois still keeps a framed photo of his workers taken before the tariffs hit. 72 people in that photo, fathers, sons, neighbors. Most now work part-time or not at all. His letter to the U.S. president was returned unopened, stamped foreign correspondence, foreign. That word says everything. When you turn your allies into foreigners, you've already begun to dismantle your own alliance system. Before jumping into the next layer, we need to understand the logic that drove this chaos. Trump didn't see trade as cooperation, he saw it as transaction. Every deal had to have a visible win, even if the long-term cost outweighed it. The administration boasted that soybean sales to China would balance the deficit, but no one mentioned the price. Strategic credibility. Beijing learned that a few farm purchases could buy Washington's silence on everything else, from Hong Kong crackdowns to technology theft. One cargo ship of soybeans was worth more politically than a dozen diplomatic protests. By the way, this pattern wasn't accidental. It was structural. When you replace institutional policy with personal bargaining, you invite what economists call asymmetric concessions, giving away the system's integrity for temporary applause. China understood this perfectly. Every Phase 1 agreement photo op was a stage-managed illusion of control. Behind the scenes, their own exports soared through back channels, electronics, machinery, even steel, thanks to exemptions quietly signed by U.S. lobbyists with agricultural interests. The America First doctrine became, in practice, whoever pays, plays. Let's move now to the Pacific itself, the logistics chain. The Busan detour, that short pause of the soybean vessel, tells a bigger story. South Korean ports became the neutral zone of Trump's divided trade empire. U.S. goods would route through Busan to avoid Chinese inspection delays, while Chinese intermediaries used the same hub to disguise their own exports as transshipped goods. It was trade theater, tariffs on paper, cooperation at sea, and everyone got their cut, except the workers. Meanwhile, Canada, frozen out of tariff relief, watched investment flee to Asia. Lumber mills closed, pulp factories shrank, and Chinese firms began buying up raw timber directly from Western Canada at discount prices. Trump's tariffs, intended to punish Canada, ended up feeding the very competitors they were meant to contain. That's what happens when economic nationalism meets logistical reality. The world reroutes around you. Don't be fooled by the slogans about energy dominance or American exports roaring back. In 2020, the U.S. trade deficit in goods actually hit a 12-year high. Exports shifted, but dependence deepened. China bought soybeans, the U.S. bought electronics, Canada sold fewer goods to the U.S., but more to Europe. Everyone adapted except the small producers who couldn't. The farmer and the sawmill owner never met, but their stories are bound by the same invisible current, the disintegration of cooperative trade under a leader who mistook conflict for strength. We need to remember, leadership is not about choosing winners. It's about preventing everyone from losing. When Trump reduced trade to a scoreboard, he forgot that economies aren't teams playing a game. They are networks living interdependent systems. Break one strand and the vibration is felt across oceans. The container ship leaves Busan. The lumber yard in Quebec stays dark. And somewhere between those two realities lies the quiet truth. A tariff lifted in Beijing can extinguish a furnace in Quebec. Before we jump into the political implications, let's pause on what this all reveals about strategy. Trade policy, in theory, is supposed to align with national goals to strengthen alliances, support industries, and project stability. But under Trump, it became improvisation masquerading as policy. Every tariff, every exemption, every tweet announcing a deal was reactive. One week, China was the enemy. The next, its purchases were proof of American strength. Canada, meanwhile, a NATO ally, a NORAD partner, a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world, was treated like a rival. This was not mere inconsistency, it was philosophy. Trumpism's economic logic rests on zero-sum thinking. For one to win, another must lose. In that framework, even allies become competitors. That's why Canada's aluminum exports, critical for U.S. manufacturing, were labeled a national security risk. It wasn't because of espionage or sabotage. It was because cooperation itself didn't fit the show's script. Conflict sells. Stability does not. Now let's move to what this meant on the ground. American farmers, briefly rescued by Chinese purchases, soon found themselves trapped by volatility. Prices swung wildly with every rumor of new tariffs or new deals. Insurance costs rose, banks hesitated to lend, and farm equipment sales plummeted. You can't plan a harvest when your market depends on the next presidential tweet. In other words, America First turned the American farmer into a day trader gambling on the moods of global politics. Meanwhile, Canadian exporters, desperate to survive, began rerouting shipments through European ports. The European Union seized the opportunity. Within months, Canadian wood and paper replaced American goods in parts of the European market. The same dynamic played out in energy and minerals. Washington's isolation didn't protect American jobs, it exported them, one miscalculated tariff at a time. By the way, there's a deeper irony here. Trump's administration often accused China of economic coercion, yet his own policies did exactly that to allies. Canada was pressured into renegotiating NAFTA under threat of auto tariffs. Mexico was told to control migration or lose trade privileges. These weren't negotiations, they were ultimatums. And when you govern by ultimatums, you don't build alliances, you build fear. But fear is not loyalty, and it collapses the moment power shifts. Let's revisit the symbolism of our two letters, one from Iowa, one from Quebec. The farmer's letter ended up framed in a local museum part of a rural revival exhibit funded by federal grants, but visitors notice something. The ink has faded. The optimism in those words feels dated, almost naive. Across the border, Alain Dubois' letter remains pinned to the locked gate of his mill, the paper yellowed by years of snow. Two artifacts of the same era, separated by a line on a map and a single word in Washington's vocabulary, ally. It shows that when governments weaponize trade for politics, they forget that economies are built by people, not slogans. Tariffs can punish factories, but they can also humiliate identities. Canada, once described by American presidents as our closest friend, was recast as an opportunist. And in doing so, the U.S. weakened the moral argument it once used against authoritarian rivals that democracies stick together. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Japan, South Korea, Australia all noticed if the U.S. could turn on Canada, what guarantee did they have? So they diversified. New trade pacts, new suppliers, new ships bypassing American ports. Trump's deal-making had taught the world a dangerous lesson. America's handshake was no longer reliable. We need to remember leadership by intimidation always looks strong until the first ally walks away. Then the empire of deals collapses under its own mistrust. The ship carrying soybeans will reach Shanghai. The letter from Quebec will never be answered. But history, like trade, keeps its receipts. And one day, someone will total the cost not in dollars, but in lost alliances. Let's continue. The soybeans have arrived in Shanghai. The ship's captain signs the final paperwork. Chinese customs officers stamp the documents with routine precision. Another cargo completed. On the surface, it looks like success. American goods moving east again, a trade war cooling down. But look closer. The price of soybeans has fallen, the freight costs have doubled, and the profits now flow through Chinese state logistics firms and global intermediaries registered in Singapore. America exports the work, China imports the control. This is not trade. It's dependence reshaped. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in the industrial town of Trois-Rivières, Quebec, the sawmill gates are still chained. The machinery sits idle, and the workers, many of them former veterans, now pick up shifts at a warehouse owned by a U.S. e-commerce company. The irony is unbearable. Canadians laid off because of U.S. Tariffs are now packing boxes for U.S. corporations that moved their profits offshore to avoid those same tariffs. This is called efficiency in the make-believe world of Washington, D.C. Now let's move to the White House, or rather to its press room. In 2019, an aide declared that the president's America First trade policy had brought Beijing to its knees. The applause line made the evening news. But here's what the cameras didn't show. That same week, China quietly signed new long-term grain contracts with Brazil and Argentina, reducing its dependency on U.S. soy by more than a third. And while Canada was busy absorbing tariff shocks, Beijing extended a trade credit line to Ottawa worth billions in the same Canada Washington had alienated. The headline victory concealed a geopolitical defeat. By the way, this isn't just about economics. It's about credibility. Every policy sends a message to the world. When Trump punished his allies to reward short-term deals with rivals, the message was simple. America's word could be bought or replaced. That message echoed far beyond trade. It weakened trust in defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic negotiation. The tariff dispute over soybeans and lumber became a metaphor for everything else. the erosion of partnership in the pursuit of optics. Let's consider the long-term consequence. The Pacific trade routes that once symbolized American-led globalization have shifted their center of gravity. The ports of Busan, Shanghai, and Qingdao now form an integrated network of digital logistics hubs, financed partly by China's Belt and Road Initiative and indirectly empowered by the instability of Trump's tariff regime. Even American shipping firms began registering their vessels abroad to avoid retaliatory duties. The America First era, in reality, outsourced American logistics. And what about Canada? Cut off from predictable access to U.S. markets, it pivoted. Ottawa deepened its ties with the European Union through CETA and negotiated entry into the CPTPP, the very trade pact Washington abandoned. The result? Canadian exporters now enjoy tariff-free access to markets that the U.S. and forfeited. In the rush to appear defiant, America surrendered the most powerful economic weapon it ever had, reliability. In other words, the tariffs didn't rebuild American strength, they redistributed it. Power shifted from Washington to Beijing, from the Rust Belt to the Pacific Rim, from cooperation to fragmentation. The world learned to trade around the United States. And every time that happens, the meaning of ally fades a little more into the language of the past. We need to remember, global leadership isn't maintained through punishment. It's sustained through predictability, respect, and fairness. When those vanish, even the most loyal partners start looking elsewhere. The farmer's soybeans reach port, the sawmill remains silent, and the alliances that once defined North America drift apart. Not because of foreign enemies, but because of domestic vanity disguised as strategy. Before we move further, let's take a step back and examine what the trade numbers can't show: the psychological damage of a fractured alliance. For decades, North American integration wasn't just about goods, it was about shared identity. The idea that the US, Canada, and Mexico could function as a single production ecosystem, one factory floor stretching across borders, was what made the continent competitive against Europe and Asia. That idea didn't collapse because of economics. It collapsed because of ego. Trump's tariff doctrine was never really about correcting trade imbalances. It was about rewriting the story of who America thinks it is. He wanted an image, the solitary giant, self-sufficient, feared and envied. But in global trade, isolation isn't independence, it's irrelevance. The American farmer cannot grow soybeans without fertilizer sourced abroad. The automaker cannot build a car without Canadian aluminum. And the smartphone in every voter's pocket depends on assembly lines spread across 3 continents. The myth of self-sufficiency was powerful and profoundly false. Let's look again at our 2 letters. The Iowa farmer wrote, "You've given us a chance to sell again." He believed that tariffs lifted from China meant protection, but protection from whom? Not from foreign competition, because the competition now came from multinational firms with no nationality at all. He was being protected from an illusion while exposed to the real storm: global corporations consolidating power. The Canadian sawmill owner's letter, in contrast, was an act of faith. He still addressed Trump as Mr. President, our partner. He still believed the rhetoric of shared democratic destiny. That's what makes it so painful. The betrayal didn't come from an enemy. It came from a friend who stopped believing in the concept of friendship itself. Now let's move to the larger context, the geopolitical one. While Trump punished Canada and courted China, he overlooked something essential. Alliances aren't just moral gestures. They're multipliers of power. In the language of strategy, They extend reach, legitimacy, and resilience. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canadian goods in the name of security, it weakened the very security architecture it claimed to defend. NATO, G7, NORAD all suddenly seemed conditional, transactional, and fragile. And Beijing noticed. By the way, the Chinese press played this brilliantly. State media ran headlines calling Trump's tariff diplomacy the end of Western unity. European officials began echoing the same concern, and within months, Beijing launched new agricultural investment programs in Africa and Southeast Asia using American-style rhetoric about mutual respect and win-win growth. The irony was unmistakable. While Washington shouted slogans about America first, Beijing quietly adopted the language of multilateralism that Washington abandoned. Let's be clear. The soybean ship that crossed the Pacific was more than a trade transaction. It was a symbol of how easily leadership can be sold for short-term applause. Every container unloaded in Shanghai represented a transfer of trust, not just product. And every silent factory in Quebec symbolized what happens when trust is treated as expendable. In other words, the true deficit of the Trump years wasn't measured in dollars or tons. It was measured in credibility. A currency that once spent takes generations to rebuild. America's allies began to hedge. Some, like Canada and the EU, turned to diversification. Others, like South Korea and Japan, started developing parallel security frameworks just in case Washington's promises evaporated again. Let's move to what came next, the long shadow these policies cast over the post-Trump landscape. When the new administration stepped in, it inherited not just tariffs and trade deficits, but something far more dangerous: mistrust, institutionalized. Canada had learned that friendship with Washington could vanish overnight. China had learned that American pressure could be deflected with a few $billion of soybean purchases and U.S. Workers had learned that political promises were cheaper than contracts. The numbers tell the story. By 2022, global soybean demand was higher than ever, yet American farmers captured a smaller share of the market than before the trade war began. Meanwhile, Canadian lumber exports to Europe rose 40%, filling gaps left by American suppliers tangled in tariff disputes. The system adapted, just not in Washington's favor. Before jumping to conclusions, let's remember how this dynamic took root. Trump believed that dominance came from disruption. Break a treaty, threaten a tariff, insult an ally. The world would bend. But economics doesn't bend. It reroutes. Markets detour, partners diversify, competitors step in. Each disruption becomes someone else's opportunity. That's what happened here. When America blocked the bridge to Canada, China built a highway around it. Now let's move from trade to diplomacy, because the two are inseparable. In Ottawa, diplomats quietly stopped waiting for Washington's clarity and began cultivating direct relations with European capitals. We can't build our economy on American mood swings, one Canadian minister admitted off record. In Beijing, officials boasted that the Phase 1 deal proved China's indispensability, and in the American Midwest, farmers who once waved campaign flags now whispered frustration. They had become props in a global bargaining game. By the way, there's an even subtler effect, the cultural one. For half a century, North American free trade was more than a policy. It was a psychological anchor. It told people on both sides of the border that democracy and prosperity were intertwined. When Trump tore at that fabric, he didn't just hurt economies, he fractured identities. Canadians began talking about strategic autonomy. Americans began talking about supply chain nationalism. The shared language of cooperation was replaced by suspicion. Let's pause here to imagine a meeting that never happened. A hypothetical phone call between the Iowa farmer and Alain Dubois, the Quebec mill owner, one man asking why his soybeans were selling again but for less than before, the other asking why his lumber now found buyers only across an ocean, both discovering they were casualties of the same illusion that strength comes from isolation. Neither of them declared war, yet both lost peace. In other words, the tariff era wasn't a conflict between nations. It was a conflict within democracy itself, between cooperation and control, between solidarity and spectacle. Trump's America chose spectacle, and the world adjusted accordingly. The Pacific roots grew denser, not weaker. Canada's mills reopened, but under new investors, European, not American. The soybean ship still sails, but its profits now fuel the logistics empires of others. We need to remember, power built on division cannot sustain itself. When a leader treats partners as pawns, those partners learn the game and play it better. The damage of the Trump tariffs is no longer visible in speeches or rallies. It's embedded in trade contracts, insurance premiums, and shipping schedules. It's the quiet rearrangement of the world's trust map, and trust, once redrawn, rarely returns to its original shape. Now, let's go beyond trade. What we're really witnessing is the moral cost of transactional politics. The idea that relationships can be priced, that loyalty can be negotiated like freight space on a ship. In the short term, it looked pragmatic. In the long term, it hollowed out the very principle that held the democratic world together, faith that partnership was safer than opportunism. When Trump lifted tariffs on China in exchange for soybean purchases, it wasn't simply a trade adjustment, it was a statement. It told every democracy, every ally, that authoritarian compliance was more profitable than shared values. Beijing didn't need to change its behavior, it just needed to buy enough beans. Meanwhile, when Canada objected to punitive tariffs, Washington called it overreaction. The difference between compliance and friendship came down to a receipt. Let's think about the scene again. The container ship crossing the Pacific, loaded with soybeans. It's the perfect metaphor. On its deck, American goods. Below deck, foreign control. The ship flies the flag of convenience from a third country. Its logistics insured by Asian firms, its profits channeled through offshore accounts. Everything looks patriotic until you read the fine print. That's globalization. Under nationalist branding, the theater of control masking the reality of dependence. Meanwhile, in Quebec, Alain Dubois' silent sawmill has become a symbol. Environmentalists visit the site now, filming documentaries about deindustrialization and dignity. They show rows of unused lumber, each beam stamped "Made for the USA," relics of a partnership that once felt unbreakable. The locals call it the factory that trusted too much. It stands as a monument to what happens when politics replaces policy. Before jumping into our final reflection, it's important to understand the psychological continuity here. Trump's trade war was never meant to end because it wasn't designed to solve anything. It was designed to perform struggle, to turn governance into spectacle. Every new tariff, every renegotiated deal became a chapter in a personal narrative of defiance. The irony, of course, is that the defiance was aimed not at enemies, but at the very allies that made American power sustainable. By the way, this pattern, alienating friends to impress foes, has deep consequences beyond economics. It shifts the moral balance of global politics. Canada's frustration wasn't just about lost profit. It was about betrayal by example. If Washington could weaponize trade against a democracy, what message did that send to smaller nations trying to resist Chinese or Russian influence? The message was simple. Don't depend on values, depend on deals. And deals, as we learned, can vanish with a signature. Let's move now to the quiet aftermath. In 2024, the World Trade Organization reported a record number of bilateral trade agreements signed without U.S. participation. Canada joined with Europe and Asia to create new supply corridors. Even Latin American nations began exploring partnerships independent of Washington. America wasn't excluded, it excluded itself, one tariff at a time. In other words, the container ship and the closed sawmill are not isolated stories, they are coordinates on a new global map, one that curves away from Washington's orbit. The irony is cruel. The very policy meant to restore sovereignty has left the U.S. more entangled, more dependent, and less trusted than before.